cows killed by aliens. That may sound like the premise of a science fiction film, but it's something many people claim is actually really happening. Seemingly every year for the last 5 decades, there are new stories about so-called cattle mutilation, and the stories are mostly all the same. Cows found dead, with cuts and slices of surgical precision. Parts of their body are missing, and sometimes there is no blood, as if someone or something removed it all from the cow's body. Who or what is doing this? Some say it's the government performing secret tests. Others say it's a satanic cult. But the main suspect in cattle mutilation stories is usually, always, aliens. Is there any truth to these fantastic claims? Let's go down the rabbit hole and into the basement office. Cattle mutilations. It's a phenomena, I mean, you see it. It's become an icon, literally. The cartoon of the flying saucer picking up the cow in the field is like, you see that image everywhere now. And it comes from this. It comes from the idea that UFOs, aliens, were targeting cows. Give me the basic gist of the cattle mutilation phenomena.
The central premise is this, that cattle, but other animals too, are being mysteriously killed, violently. A typical mutilation will have a checklist, strange cuts that look very precise, as if a laser or something like that generating high heat.
Surgical knife or something.
Exactly. Yeah. No tracks around the animal. The bodies are exsanguinated. The blood is drained. There's not the blood that you would expect, for example, if there had been a predator attack, a chase, a kill, a fight. Certain parts of the animals sometimes are defleshed, removed, eyes gouged out, the anus, sexual organs more generally, the idea that something reproductive may be about this. Also, sometimes there is UFO activity associated with a lot of this. Oh, I saw strange lights in the sky, and when I checked in the morning, one of my cows had been mutilated. And it's not exclusively, but pretty much seems to be an American phenomenon.
The American phenomena of cattle mutilation, also known as mutes, saw a wave of cases across the entire country during the 1970s and 80s. But the first case, the one that set the tone, happened in 1967, and it didn't actually involve any cattle. On September 9th, 1967, in Alamosa, Colorado, a rancher found a horse that had been missing for a few days. It was dead, and parts of its body were gone. The rancher's mother, an 87-year-old woman, claimed she saw a UFO in the sky the day the horse went missing. Wild rumors soon spread, and within weeks, the national news media was writing about Snippy the horse.
Well, Snippy or Lady, depending on which account you read. My understanding is that it was actually Lady, but Snippy was another horse.
Meaning, Lady was the actual name of the horse that died. Snippy was the name of the horse's father.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yes, and the media got the name wrong, but because the media just copy-pastes, Snippy stuck. So right off the bat with the Snippy the horse story, there's a factual inaccuracy. You know, they get the name wrong. But that notwithstanding, what is the case?
Well, this is a horse that was partially defleshed, the head and the neck. This became known as the case, like, aliens killed my horse.
Yeah, the headline I think was "Flying Saucers Killed My Horse."
Yeah, it's the first case that makes cattle mutilation or animal mutilation a phenomenon. And as such, it's a little bit like serial killers. You look for the first case, and it shows you what the pattern is.
This is Snippy. Well, actually Lady, found by ranchers days after going missing. According to the ranchers, the horse was found like this. All the flesh on the head and neck is gone, as if sliced off with precision by a sharp instrument. Local authorities were called, but the sheriff brushed it off, suggesting the horse died from a lightning strike. Because no authorities were initially involved, wild claims about the horse's death went unchallenged. The main unfounded claim was that a UFO, specifically a flying saucer, was involved in the horse's death.
The press writes the story, and the press includes the UFO stuff, the flying saucer stuff, a flying saucer killed my horse, and obviously that spreads like wildfire through the media. The horse's death scene becomes like a shrine. People from all over come to visit, the horse, to see the horse that the media was saying was killed by aliens. It becomes this cultural event.
The body of the horse remained on the ground, rotting away, and being eaten by scavengers. By the time any actual scientific investigators showed up, most evidence at the scene had been completely trampled and contaminated by hundreds of sightseers. The Condon Committee, a government-funded group from the University of Colorado, did a scientific examination of Snippy the horse, and in their report concluded that, quote, there was no evidence to support the assertion that the horse's death was associated in any way with abnormal causes. The group found that the horse had had a severe infection and possibly died from that. Also, 2 bullet wounds were found on the horse's rear legs, though it is possible these came after the horse had died. The flesh missing from the head and neck were determined to just be from scavengers like coyotes, birds, and insects eating at the dead horse's flesh. Regarding supposed sightings of UFOs in the area of Snippy's death, the report concluded none of these sighting reports were considered to be current or strange enough to warrant detailed investigation. These scientific conclusions, while indeed reported in the press, could not compete with the original story of a flying saucer zapping a horse. And so the story persisted. The skeleton of the horse was preserved and eventually put inside a UFO museum where science fiction fans still, to this day, come to see the horse killed by aliens in 1967.
So Snippy the horse, by the time we reach the 70s, is already in the brains of people. It was a wide story, it was a popular story, that's already part of pop culture.
Snippy-esque stories of mutilated cows started popping up in various states like Kansas and Nebraska. But the cattle mutilation mystery exploded nationwide after a number of stories in Colorado suggested that a satanic cult of devil worshippers could be behind the mayhem.
In the 70s in Colorado, 1975, a few ranchers find some dead cows. They're sliced up. They report it to law enforcement, right? I think someone killed my cows. This doesn't look like animals did this or predators did this. I think someone did this. And so what the police obviously have to investigate that. So at this point, before the press really starts writing about this, before the press really starts writing about these dead cows, it's more or less a local issue. It's like a local rancher, law enforcement, what's going on. Now there's a small town local paper, a local reporter, Dorothy Altridge. She gets wind of these mutilated cows and writes a massive article, front page, all bold. Are Satan's phantom killers mutilating cattle? And that sends people into a frenzy. Even people locals who hadn't heard the story yet, read that and they're like, what the hell? Satan's phantom killers are in our town? And it was just this like hysteria, and people went wild and crazy. And the story itself was like reprinted, obviously by the Associated Press, and like went everywhere. Dorothy kind of got this limelight on her because everyone was reading her story. So she writes another article about satanic witches and a symbol. Here's a anti-Satanist, anti-witch symbol that you can cut out of our newspaper and post on your door, and it will keep the witches at bay. This was the state of mind of these people, cutting out like anti-witch symbols to put on their door. What were some of the signs, or what were some of the telltale things that maybe this could be Satanists?
Well, again, it is the idea of sacrifice, the killing of a living thing. And this would be done to honor Satan and maybe to show your devotion to Satan. Satan is the embodiment of evil, therefore how can I mirror that in a ritual and worship him at the same time? By killing something. But also the idea of a blood ritual, cutting blood, taking out genital areas, the idea that there's a sexual aspect to some of this. And so those are some of the signs, and there's no denying that when you look at animal mutilations more generally, it is one of the theories that's still out there.
What was first a local issue, ranchers, I think, hey sheriff, I think someone killed my horse, quickly, and I mean quickly, became this national story about a satanic cult, right? And what happens then is suddenly the townsfolk are worried, are Satanists here? Are Satanists here? Are Satanists in our town? They're coming to our town, they're killing things in our town. So it's panic, and so the mayors have to get involved and calm people down. Don't worry, we're gonna get to the bottom of this. The Ranchers Association puts up money in reward for more information on the deaths of cattle because they want to show that they support their ranchers, right? And it goes all the way up to the governor, where the governor gets involved because he wants his voters to think that he's on top of this. And so he says, don't worry, we're going to investigate and get to the bottom of this, and you know, this is unacceptable and everything. Each one of those things validates what people are reading in the newspaper. They read about Satanists in the newspaper, and then the next day they read that the governor says we're going to get to the bottom of it. They read about a cult killing cattle in mass, and the next day a reward publicly is put out in reward. And the general public connects those two and thinks that it's all, oh, the governor's getting involved, so what I read in the paper must be true.
Authorities ultimately found no evidence linking the mutilated cattle to a satanic cult or any other organized group of people. In one instance, the rumor of satanic cults was eventually traced back to 2 prisoners at a maximum security prison who, in an effort to negotiate a lesser prison sentence, offered authorities information about a satanic cult. This information was later determined to be false, and scientific analysis determined that all the cows linked to potential satanic sacrifice had in fact died of natural causes and had been mutilated by scavengers like coyotes, birds, and bugs. But despite this, spooky conspiratorial stories about the mutilations of cattle continued to grab the attention of the public, and soon a new suspect stole the headlines.
Dorothy does not stop. She writes another article where she mentions that in UFOs right in the headline. And she introduces the idea that UFOs could be behind all these cattle mutilations that are happening. It's the first time that UFOs are really kind of mentioned, that what you've been seeing in the paper and everyone's talking about is probably UFOs. And boom, as soon as that happens, UFO people from around the country are just like, yes, like it's definitely UFOs. You know, it's definitely UFOs. They begin to appropriate cattle mutilations because flying saucer believers, UFO believers, up to that point were struggling with the whole idea of physical evidence. They had flying saucer stories, but they had no like physical evidence, nothing to touch, feel. Cattle mutilations represented a game changer for UFO believers. There it is. It's right there. It's laying dead in a field. UFOs did that. Physical evidence. Done. And so there was like this clamor from the UFO field to like adopt cattle mutilations as their own.
Yes, I absolutely get that. And I think going back to Dorothy even, the wider question is she reporting on the phenomenon, or in a sense, is she creating it? I don't mean making it up, but I mean, are her theories then being seized upon, and every time anyone sees a dead cow ever, does it suddenly become one moment Satanists, the next aliens? And yeah, I think there is something to that. The idea of a meme, spreading, belief spreading through a society about something. But yeah, I absolutely take your point. Ufology has always suffered with, we got a few blurry photos, particularly in the early days, but as you say, with animal mutilations, the animal's there, it exists, it has been killed. So the challenge is then, well, can we genuinely take this undeniable physical body and say that anything genuinely mysterious has happened or not?
Right.
And that's the challenge.
One UFO believer in particular took it upon himself to ensure that everyone knew that aliens could be behind cattle mutilations. Whenever a new mutilated cow would show up in Kansas, Colorado, Texas, or elsewhere, local law enforcement would suddenly receive a package from Tom Adams.
So after the hysterical news that was coming out of Colorado in 1975 and starting to spread across the nation of all this crazy stuff that was happening, this guy named Tom Adams, who was, into UFOs, into the fringe paranormal stuff, he started becoming obsessed with cattle mutilations, and he would obsessively look for and cut out every news clipping about mutes, and he would collect them and organize them by state. And he had a monthly newsletter called Stigmata on updates on the latest mutes. And he was essential, this character, Tom Adams, in pushing the cattle mutilation national, state by state, because when New Mexico would get some cattle mutilations and local law enforcement were going, is this the same as Colorado? They would receive literally a package in the mail on their police desk from Tom Adams to so-and-so sheriff. They would open it up, and in there would be every news clipping from their state from like the last 10 years that Tom Adams had obsessively collected, and he would say, you have a huge problem.
Yes, I'm familiar with him, and I think this is a classic example of where somebody has an expectation planted in their minds. The cops receive this, and it looks pretty much, almost like a case file.
Yeah.
And you would think, this is a thing. So instead of going in and saying, let's just investigate and see where the facts lead us, you have this preconceived notion that there is a national phenomenon and that it's going to get the attention of the local authorities, the mayor, maybe even the governor.
Yes.
And you do something.
Yeah. I like that it was essentially like a case file landing on their desk.
Yeah. And cops have to prioritize things. But if you get a thick folder that shows that this has happened in other places and it's generated a lot of media attention, it tells you as a cop, I'm going to get questions about this. People are going to want to know, what are you doing? So it kind of skews things from the outset, because you start with this idea in your head that it's all real, it's serious, and that you are going to be held to account.
Sheriffs across the country continued to receive new packages from Tom Adams. And before long, new stories about cattle mutilations were popping up in multiple states coast to coast. And the theory of extraterrestrials killing American cows would soon become permanently fused together by former beauty pageant winner turned television news journalist Linda Moulton Howe.
All of this stuff reaches like a whole nother level with the release of A Strange Harvest. What was A Strange Harvest?
This is Linda Moulton Howe's TV documentary. She is an investigative journalist, and she did a report on this, and she looked into these claims and this TV documentary, and then a follow-up book called Alien Harvest, really, I think, cemented the fusion of animal mutilations with ufology.
Yeah, it fused the two.
Yeah.
Right? Sure, because her theory is 100% it's aliens. It's aliens, it's aliens, it's aliens. Is it safe to say I've heard her called like the queen of cattle mutilations? She's really the one that kind of pushes it to a whole nother level.
Yes, and she is a huge voice as well in the UFO community now, so of course that view became, because of Linda's championing it, really the dominant theory. The idea of a strange harvest, an alien harvest, the idea that material, genetic material, whatever it may be, is being literally, physically harvested from these animals by extraterrestrials, and you get into this rich story which for example has in it the theory that there's some sort of treaty between the United States government and the extraterrestrials, and part of that treaty is you can mutilate the cows and do what you like with the animals, but when you abduct people, you must not harm them and you must put them back. And I mean, it gets down to that level. It's a detail-rich theory of how this goes down.
That's a pretty good deal.
That's
If I was an alien, I'd take that deal.
Yeah, well, in exchange, humans get some crumbs from the technological table. So in this theory, for example, the United States was given technologies which enabled it to win the Cold War through technological supremacy, that sort of thing. Now, it is, of course, I should say, just a theory, but it's out there. And as I say, this cemented the fusion of animal mutilations with ufology, and is really Linda's work is how it became the dominant theory.
After Linda Moulton Howell's Emmy Award-winning documentary and best-selling book, UFOs Killing Cows officially became part of American pop culture. A book publisher in New York City, hoping to cash in on the rising popularity of mutes, hired ABC News and New York Times contributor Dan Kagan to go on a 2-year nationwide investigation of cattle mutilations. Kagan, along with science fiction writer Ian Summers, were tasked with finding evidence of aliens. Their book, Mute Evidence, which chronicles their investigation, was published in 1984.
We went into this with the notion that I'm going to believe everything. Let's assume that it's all true. Let's collect all the information. Let's follow out every trail, every hypothesis, every claim, every case that we can, and see what comes out. And once we started doing that, we discovered that the evidence could not be substantiated by any legitimate or credible sources. I went back to a number of sources in several of these stories and actually put my hands on the original on-scene evidence at the scene of the animal, etc. And in every case, the stories that were promulgated and that had strange or mysterious overtones, they weren't true. They simply were not true.
By tracing each claim back to its original source, Kagan discovered that many cattle mutilation stories in the media were like a game of telephone, where every time the claim was repeated by someone else, new details would be added, and most of those details weren't necessarily true or based on facts and evidence.
Sloppy reporting, where I would see traced articles back to their source, where the same anecdotes were retold in different newspapers over a course of several years in different waves of mutilations in different states. And it's clear that the reporter never went back to the original source of where this was initiated and never checked on the veracity of the original story. They just repeated it. And these things became part of the myth.
Kagan's fact-checking journey eventually led him to Colorado, to the office of Dorothy Outridge. The day Kagan arrived, Dorothy's latest story had just published. Psychic blames cattle mutilation on space aliens. Kagan asked Dorothy questions about her previous reporting on mutilated cows. Questions, he says, that Dorothy couldn't answer.
Well, I kept asking her, how do you know this? How do you know that this happened? I kept asking her, did you look at the carcass? Did you do this? Did you do that? And it was like Aunt B from the Andy Griffith Show. It was like, oh, I don't know much about that. Oh, it was kind of like, she said, I'm not much of an investigator. Not much of an investigator. It's like, Dorothy, why should we listen to anything you say?
In their book, Kagan and Summers write about their encounter with Dorothy Outridge like this. Of all the people we had met so far, Outridge was the only one with whom we felt a sense of absolute hopelessness. This was the person whose UFO articles had almost single-handedly fired the start of the mutilation phenomena in Colorado in 1975. This woman, who constantly said, "Oh, I'm not a good investigator," had almost single-handedly caused a statewide panic with her coverage. Beyond examples of credulous and lazy reporting, Kagan discovered that newspapers were also reaching out to untrained experts to make unqualified conclusions regarding a cow's death.
They're always looking for a local expert or an expert of some sort. And the highest I've ever seen them go is a local veterinarian. And a local veterinarian may be a great veterinarian, may be a great doctor, but he doesn't know anything about postmortem pathology. It's a whole field of specialty.
The forensic science process is a crucial part of investigating any death, and it's something crucially missing from most cases of cattle mutilation. With humans, if a dead body is found, law enforcement will usually be the first on the scene. They conduct interviews and look for any initial noticeable clues. Next, trained medical and forensic investigators will also examine the scene and look for other clues. The body is then moved by a coroner to a morgue, where a trained pathologist will conduct an autopsy. It's during this autopsy, conducted by a specially trained expert, where a cause of death can be officially and legally determined. The same exact process exists for dead animals, especially if there's been foul play. Law enforcement, trained forensic investigators, and finally, a necropsy performed by a trained veterinarian pathologist. But with nearly all cattle mutilation cases that have captured news headlines, this process often stops right here. Someone finds a dead cow, and sometimes law enforcement shows up. But that's usually it. There is rarely, ever, any real post-mortem scientific analysis. Newspapers often print claims like no blood was found inside the cow, or the cow's organs were removed with surgically precise cuts. But how was that determined? In most, if not all cases, claims like this were simply based on the conclusions of people absolutely not qualified to make those conclusions. So Dan Kagan gathered up boxes of cattle mutilation evidence and took it all to Dr. John King at Cornell University, who at the time was considered the #1 veterinary pathologist in the world.
I put all my evidence in front of him. I asked him to rule on it. I said, tell me what you see here. And he just basically disqualified all of it with natural explanations. He didn't find a single thing that was suspicious or unusual or that wasn't easily accounted for with normal postmortem conditions. Not a single thing.
Public hysteria about cattle mutilation put pressure on state authorities to do something about it. And so the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, or CBI, launched a statewide investigation. CBI investigated 203 cases of reported cattle mutilation.
What they found was dead cows, and they could not find any evidence, scientific evidence, that proved that there was anything paranormal or bizarre about the deaths of these animals. They couldn't find anything.
While CBI did not find any evidence of aliens or anything supernatural, they did find 11 cases where humans had indeed mutilated the cow, mostly after the cow was dead. CBI attributed these cases to copycats, people who were inspired by the stories they had read in the media. In New Mexico, U.S. Senator Floyd Haskell requested the FBI investigate his state's cattle mutilations. But because technically the FBI had no jurisdiction over such an investigation, an independent, federally funded investigation was created by the New Mexico District Attorney's Office. Heading up the investigation was a recently retired FBI agent named Kenneth Rommel. Rommel spent 1 year looking into New Mexico's cattle mutilations. At a press conference, Rommel stated, "I am of the opinion that all of the mutilations investigated by me were caused by and totally consistent with what one would expect to find from normal predation, scavenger activity, and decomposition of a dead animal." Rommel then added that he also discovered fantasy and falsehoods in previous reports. "I have found a great deal of very creative writing. I have found statements and opinions totally unsupported by facts. I have found errors in official reports." While he didn't name names, Kagan, Summers, and others knew he was talking, at least in part, about New Mexico police officer Gabe Valdez.
Gabe Valdez was a UFO believer before this, an avid UFO reader going into this. And since a lot of these reports came from him, Rommel went and interviewed him. And they went through his reports and they're like, What do you mean there was evidence? There was evidence that a saucer had landed. What do you mean? Did you take pictures? No. So you just wrote that in your report? He would just write things in his report they found with no follow-ups, no substantiating evidence. Rommel actually, he's very diplomatic. He's, because he knows the public's eyes on him, so he's not mean. But he's essentially saying a lot of this police officer's reports read like science fiction, like someone's writing a fantasy.
In one case, Officer Valdez reported that a 600-pound cow was found at the top of a tree, and he hypothesized that it had been dropped there from a UFO. But when Kenneth Rommel interviewed and pressed Valdez about this report, Valdez eventually admitted that the cow had been found at the base of the tree. Rommel stated, "The change of location is of major significance in that it not only totally undermines the theory the animal was dropped from the air, but also immediately suggests the cow was probably killed by lightning, one of the most common causes of livestock deaths. In addition, this admission seriously undermines the credibility of all the officer's previous statements." In June 1980, Rommel released a 300-page report. Rommel, just like the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, found no aliens and nothing paranormal, just scavengers eating the dead carcasses of cows, and maybe a few human copycats. UFO believers attacked Rommel's report, calling it a lie and a cover-up. Officer Gabe Valdez, now a celebrity in the UFO community, would go on to continue to look for the aliens that were killing cattle. In 1996, Valdez joined the National Institute of Discovery Science, a paranormal investigation group funded by billionaire Robert Bigelow. The Institute's first big investigation was at Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, a supposed UFO hotspot where unexplained cattle mutilations were claimed to have occurred. According to sources, Bigelow purchased the ranch after it was brought to his attention by former Miss Idaho and Queen of Cattle Mutilations, Linda Moulton Howe. To this day, Skinwalker Ranch remains an ongoing source of new spooky cattle mutilation stories. Here is Brandon Fugel, the current owner of the ranch, with his paranormal investigation team, standing around a dead cow. They claim something spooky is happening to cows on the ranch. None of them are forensic veterinary medical examiners. Fugel, a real estate mogul, is seen here, wearing some kind of Ghostbuster backpack, as he examines a dead cow with whatever that is. You can find links to my previous reports on Skinwalker Ranch in the description below. The American cattle mutilation hysteria of the 1970s and 80s eventually died down and never again reached that level of popularity. But the folklore of UFOs attacking cows would be permanently married to American pop culture.
I think you can talk about this as part pop culture, part hysteria, how panic about something spreads in society, sometimes out of all proportion to the actual thing. And as with a lot of this, there's probably not a single neat answer. My question is still, if you strip away all the panic, all the hysteria, all the embellished stories, all the I want to believe stuff, is there still something anomalous with a small number of the cases? I mean, I guess it's like UFOs. Most cases turn out to be misidentifications. So, you might say the same with animal mutilations. Some of these deaths are going to be predators, some are going to be disease, some are going to be the animal was poisoned, some struck by lightning, some this, some that. At the end of all that, is there anything else? And that's the question.
Right, and the answer is no. The answer is no, Nick. But the story persists. The meme persists. The flying saucer picking up the cow is a now universally known image. And the stories persist to this day.
Seemingly every year, there have been new stories about cattle mutilations. Even today, the stories persist. And they're mostly the same as the stories from the 70s and 80s. Cows found dead with cuts and slices of surgical precision. Parts of their body are missing, and sometimes there is no blood, as if someone or something removed it all from the cow's body. Who or what is doing this? I have a homework assignment for you. Anytime you see a news story about dead mutilated cows, like this one from NPR, hit Control F on your keyboard and then search for these key words: necropsy, pathologist, cause of death. Most of the time, you'll find that none of these words will appear, and here in this article, they don't. But these words, ideally, should appear in any news story about a cow's mysterious death. So if none of the proper scientific steps were taken to officially determine the cow's cause of death, it simply doesn't matter what spooky stories are in the article. You can outright dismiss them. Here's another story in the New York Times about a series of cattle mutilations. There are 0 mentions of any forensic analysis or necropsy by a veterinary pathologist. There are, however, mentions of UFOs and satanic cults as potential culprits. No, this article isn't from 1975. It's from 2023. It's the same story told the same way. As the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.